Let me explain right away why this ceasefire won't bring a good outcome for America or anyone else. But if you, like me, support Palestine, you might be a bit disappointed because this isn't a lasting ceasefire. Anyway, let us get into the video. The celebration lasted exactly 48 hours. Families in Tel Aviv hugged returning hostages while crowds in Gaza cheered the release of prisoners. World leaders praised the breakthrough ceasefire between Israel and Hamas as a turning point for regional peace. Then, on the third day, the first rocket crossed the border. A shopkeeper in southern Israel heard the familiar sound of sirens and rushed his children to the shelter they'd hoped to never use again. A mother in Gaza watched Israeli drones return to the skies and wondered if her brief moment of relief was already over. The ceasefire everyone called historic might not survive its first week, according to Reuters and regional security sources. The October 2025 agreement between Israel and Hamas included prisoner exchanges, humanitarian aid access, and military de-escalation protocols designed to build trust between sworn enemies. But building trust requires time that neither side may have before hardliners on both sides decide the cost of peace exceeds its benefits. This isn't the first ceasefire to collapse between Israel and Hamas. It probably won't be the last. But this time feels different because the regional players backing each side have more to gain from continued conflict than from lasting peace. Welcome to Crisis Zone. Today we're examining why everyone celebrated an agreement that almost nobody believes will hold, and what happens to the Middle East when this ceasefire follows the path of all the others. The October 2025 ceasefire emerged not from genuine reconciliation but from exhaustion. Israel had achieved limited military objectives in Gaza, but faced mounting international pressure and economic costs from sustained operations. Hamas had survived yet another Israeli campaign, but faced a humanitarian catastrophe that threatened to turn Gaza's population against them, according to the agreement details reported by Al Jazeera and Israeli media. The deal included 3 phases designed to build momentum toward lasting peace. Phase 1 involved immediate cessation of hostilities and exchange of prisoners and hostages. Hamas released 30 Israeli civilians while Israel freed 150 Palestinian detainees. Phase 2 promised increased humanitarian aid access to Gaza, reopening of border crossings under international monitoring, and gradual withdrawal of Israeli forces from populated areas. This phase depended entirely on Phase 1 succeeding without major violations. Phase 3, the most ambitious and least defined, outlined negotiations toward permanent ceasefire terms including Hamas disarmament, reconstruction funding, and discussion of Gaza's political future. According to diplomatic sources, this phase was deliberately vague because no one believed they'd get far enough to need specific plans. The mediation architecture reveals the complexity of regional interests. Egypt hosted the negotiations and provided security guarantees for border arrangements. Qatar offered financial incentives for reconstruction and economic development. The United States applied pressure on Israel to accept terms while Saudi Arabia quietly assured regional players that American commitment remains solid despite public diplomatic disputes. But the deeper you examine the agreement, the more you realize it's built on contradictions that may be impossible to resolve. Israel demands Hamas disarmament while Hamas insists on maintaining resistance capability. Israel wants international forces monitoring Gaza while Hamas refuses any arrangement that looks like occupation. Israel conditions reconstruction aid on security guarantees while Hamas conditions cooperation on political concessions Israel has never offered. These aren't technical disagreements that negotiators can split differences on their fundamental compatibilities between parties whose core objectives remain unchanged despite temporary ceasefire needs. Here's the mini recap. The October 2025 ceasefire emerged from exhaustion rather than reconciliation. Includes 3 phases with escalating ambitions. Involves multiple regional mediators with competing interests. And rests on contradictions between Israeli and Hamas core objectives that may prove impossible to reconcile. Washington faces impossible political mathematics in the Israel-Hamas ceasefire. Supporting Israel's security requirements while responding to international pressure for Palestinian humanitarian relief, all while maintaining credibility with Arab partners who doubt American commitment to equitable solutions. The domestic political pressures operate in opposite directions simultaneously. According to polling data, younger American voters increasingly sympathize with Palestinian grievances and question unconditional support for Israeli military operations. Meanwhile, traditional pro-Israel constituencies demand unwavering backing for Israeli security measures and oppose any agreement that leaves Hamas with governing authority in Gaza. President Trump's administration navigated these pressures through carefully calibrated ambiguity. Public statements emphasized America's commitment to Israeli security, while private diplomatic channels asked UAE Arab partners that Washington supported humanitarian access and eventual Palestinian political rights. According to State Department sources, this dual-track approach satisfied neither constituency, but prevented complete breakdown of relationships with either side. The military aid dimension creates particularly sharp contradictions. America provides Israel with billions in annual military assistance while simultaneously funding humanitarian aid to Gaza that Israeli operations have made necessary. This creates the appearance of funding both sides of the conflict, generating criticism from Americans who oppose involvement in Middle Eastern disputes regardless of which parties they support. Regional alliance management adds another layer of complexity. Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Jordan all depend on American security partnerships, but face domestic pressure to support Palestinian causes. According to diplomatic reporting, these countries privately cooperated with ceasefire negotiations while publicly maintaining distance from arrangements that appeared to legitimize continued Israeli control over Palestinian territories. The credibility stakes extend beyond immediate ceasefire sustainability. If America cannot translate diplomatic pressure into lasting peace between Israel and Hamas, rivals will argue that American influence in the Middle East has become hollow. China has already positioned itself as alternative mediator through Iran connections, while Russia exploits Western divisions to expand its own regional influence. Most concerning is the precedent problem. If the ceasefire collapses like previous agreements, it reinforces the perception that America lacks either the will or capability to enforce settlements it negotiates. That perception affects not just Middle Eastern conflicts, but American credibility in European and Asian security commitments where allies depend on Washington's follow-through. While Israel and Hamas signed the ceasefire agreement, the countries and organizations surrounding them will ultimately determine whether peace holds or collapses back into conflict that could spread beyond Gaza's borders. Iran views Hamas' survival as strategic victory against Israel and American influence. According to intelligence assessments, Iranian financial and military support for Hamas has continued despite ceasefire provisions that prohibit weapons transfers. Tehran calculates that maintaining Hamas capability serves Iranian interests even if periodic conflicts restart, because each round of fighting strains Israeli resources and international support. Hezbollah in Lebanon watches the Israel-Hamas dynamic carefully, coordinating with Iranian advisors on whether to maintain current restraint or open northern front that would force Israel into multi-theater conflict. According to security sources, Hezbollah has used the Gaza ceasefire period to rebuild capabilities along the Lebanese border, while avoiding provocations that might trigger Israeli preemptive strikes. Egypt plays crucial but contradictory roles as both ceasefire mediator and blockade enforcer. Cairo wants stability on its border, but also fears Hamas' success could inspire Egypt's own Muslim Brotherhood opposition. According to diplomatic reporting, Egyptian security services maintain intelligence cooperation with Israel while Egyptian government publicly supports Palestinian rights, creating tensions that complicate consistent policy. Saudi Arabia seeks regional leadership through peace initiatives, but also competes with Iran for influence throughout the Middle East. Riyadh has offered reconstruction funding for Gaza conditional on political arrangements that exclude Hamas from governing authority, knowing Hamas will likely reject such conditions. According to Gulf diplomatic sources, Saudi's strategy aims less at actual peace than at positioning itself as responsible regional power while Iran backs resistance groups. Turkey under Erdogan provides political support and humanitarian aid to Hamas while maintaining trade relationships with Israel that create economic incentives for stability. This balancing act allows Turkey to appeal to both Islamist constituencies and Western allies, but also means Turkish policy shifts based on domestic political needs rather than consistent principles. Qatar hosts Hamas political leadership and provides financial support while also hosting American military bases and maintaining diplomatic relations with Israel, according to Qatari officials. This positioning allows them to serve as mediators, but it also creates suspicions about whose interests Qatar actually prioritizes during negotiations. The United Nations agencies operating in Gaza face impossible situations where humanitarian mandates require cooperation with Hamas governing structures while donor countries demand accountability that Hamas often prevents. This creates operational paralysis where aid agencies can neither fully deliver services nor withdraw without abandoning civilian populations. Historical patterns and current structural conditions suggest that the October 2025 ceasefire faces overwhelming odds against survival beyond initial implementation phases, not because parties lack desire for peace, but because they lack ability to deliver what the agreement requires. The hardliner veto problem operates on both sides. Within Israel, political factions oppose any arrangement that leaves Hamas with governing authority or military capability. According to Israeli political analyses, Netanyahu's coalition includes parties that view Gaza ceasefire as betrayal of security principles and opportunity to force elections. Any significant Hamas violation gives these factions justification to demand military response that collapses ceasefire terms. Within Gaza, Hamas faces pressure from more radical factions like Islamic Jihad who view ceasefire as surrender and actively seek provocations that force Hamas to resume fighting. According to Palestinian political sources, Hamas leadership worries more about challenges from hardliners than about Israeli military pressure, creating incentives to demonstrate resistance through low-level violations that eventually trigger larger responses. The economic reconstruction problem creates another structural vulnerability. Gaza needs billions in reconstruction aid, but donor countries condition funding on political arrangements that neither Israel nor Hamas will accept. This creates a gap between ceasefire promises and actual improvements in civilian conditions that could undermine popular support for maintaining peace. The prisoner exchange mechanisms include built-in escalation triggers. Israel released 150 Palestinian prisoners in exchange for 30 Israeli hostages, but hundreds more remain detained on both sides. According to the agreement terms, additional releases depend on sustained ceasefire compliance, but each side has incentives to accuse the other of violations that justify stopping releases. The border control arrangements require trust that doesn't exist. Egypt and international monitors are supposed to prevent weapons smuggling while allowing humanitarian access. But the practical implementation requires cooperation from parties who actively seek to cheat these systems. According to security experts, both Israel and Hamas have capabilities to undermine monitoring in ways that other parties may never detect or prove. The timeline pressures compound every other problem. Each ceasefire phase has deadlines for implementation steps, but meeting these deadlines requires political decisions that both Israeli and Hamas leaderships may be unable to make due to domestic constraints. Missing deadlines creates justifications for abandoning agreement terms entirely. Perhaps most fundamentally, the ceasefire doesn't address underlying grievances that drive the conflict. Palestinians still live under blockade conditions while Israel still faces rocket threats. Neither party achieved objectives through fighting, but neither accepted losses that would justify fundamental policy changes. When the ceasefire breaks down and current conditions suggest when rather than if the resulting conflict could exceed previous rounds in scope, intensity, and regional spillover effects that bring American forces directly into combat operations. The immediate trigger will probably look minor. A rocket fired by Islamic Jihad that Hamas claims to oppose. An Israeli raid targeting imminent threats that Palestinians view as ceasefire violation. A border incident where each side has different versions of what actually happened. According to conflict escalation studies, major wars often begin with provocations that neither leadership wanted, but both felt compelled to respond to. Israeli military response would likely be more intense than previous operations because domestic political pressure would demand decisive action after ceasefire collapse, according to Israeli defense planning leaked to media. Contingency plans include ground operations deeper into Gaza, extended campaign durations, and less concern for international criticism after demonstrating willingness to pursue diplomatic solutions. Regional escalation becomes more likely after ceasefire failure than during initial conflict. Hezbollah might judge that opening northern front while Israel fights in Gaza creates strategic opportunity. Iran might escalate support for proxy forces to exploit Israeli overextension. Syria could allow attacks from its territory, betting that Israel cannot respond effectively across multiple fronts simultaneously. American involvement would face different pressures after ceasefire collapse than during initial conflict, according to diplomatic sources. Washington spent significant political capital negotiating the October agreement, and its failure would damage American credibility in ways that create pressure for direct intervention to prevent complete regional destabilization. The humanitarian catastrophe would exceed previous crises because infrastructure damage from multiple conflict rounds creates compounding effects, according to un-agency assessments. Gaza's water, electricity, and medical systems are already operating at minimal capacity, and another major conflict could trigger complete collapse that makes territory uninhabitable, regardless of military outcomes. Economic impacts would spread beyond Gaza through energy market volatility, supply chain disruptions, and investor uncertainty about regional stability, according to financial modeling. Another Israel-Hamas war would likely coincide with other regional tensions in ways that multiply market responses beyond what individual conflicts would generate. The political consequences within both Israel and Palestinian territories could produce leadership changes that make future negotiations even more difficult. Israeli voters tend to shift rightward after conflicts while Palestinian populations often radicalize against perceived collaborative leaders, creating political dynamics that reduce moderate voices needed for peace processes. International law and humanitarian accountability debates would intensify with each conflict round, creating legal and political pressures that affect future American freedom of action in supporting Israeli operations while also attempting to maintain relationships with Arab partners who face domestic pressure to distance from Washington. Here's the mini recap. Ceasefire collapse would likely trigger more intense Israeli military response. Regional escalation involving Hezbollah and Iran. Increased American involvement pressures. Humanitarian catastrophe exceeding previous crises. Global economic disruption. Domestic political radicalization. And international law complications that affect all future regional conflict management. The October 2025 Israel-Hamas ceasefire represents hope for peace, but also demonstrates why peace remains elusive despite everyone's exhaustion from endless conflict. The agreement emerged from necessity rather than reconciliation, involves multiple regional players with competing interests, and rests on implementation requirements that structural conditions make nearly impossible to fulfill. America's role as mediator and guarantor creates political pressures from multiple directions while rivals exploit Washington's difficult position to advance their own regional influence. Regional actors including Iran, Hezbollah, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Qatar all have stakes in outcomes that create numerous pressure points where external parties can trigger renewed conflict. The ceasefire faces hardliner opposition, economic gaps, procedural triggers, monitoring challenges, and unresolved grievances that suggest collapse is more likely than success. When breakdown occurs, The resulting conflict could exceed previous rounds in intensity, duration, and regional spillover effects that directly threaten American interests and potentially require American military involvement. Understanding these dynamics helps explain why celebrating any Middle Eastern ceasefire requires acknowledging that peace agreements often mark brief pauses between conflicts rather than lasting resolutions to underlying disputes that have persisted for generations. Subscribe to Crisis Zone and join Americans who understand that Middle Eastern conflicts create consequences beyond regional boundaries through alliance commitments, economic relationships, and strategic interests that connect distant conflicts to American domestic security and prosperity.